Hey guys! Tonight, we step into a world of glittering gowns, polished wooden floors, and candlelight that flickers like secrets in every corridor. You trudge through the heavy doors of Whitehall Palace in 1540, imagining the echo of your own footsteps, competing with the rustle of silk and the soft clink of chains on guards. The air smells faintly of beeswax, smoke, and something sweet baking in a distant kitchen. Though you probably won't survive this without noticing the tension that underpins even the most lavish feasts. Court isn't just elegant, it's a minefield, and one wrong word or glance can explode into scandal faster than you can say Tudor intrigue. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's fun to picture us all sprawled across centuries together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're at Henry VIII's court, surrounded by men in slashed doublets and ruffs so stiff they might snap your neck if you bump into them. The king himself is a looming presence, physically massive and temperamentally explosive, striding through corridors with a gait that commands both fear and awe. Everywhere you look, courtiers bend, bow, or chatter with polite insincerity, calculating alliances and fortunes in every measured smile. You notice that even the chandeliers seem to hang on your attention, reflecting not just light, but ambition, vanity, and the ever-present threat of falling out of favor. It's hard to imagine that beneath the tapestries and gilt frames, whispering tongues are already plotting the rise and fall of those who think they are untouchable. In one corner, a lady in waiting adjusts her hair before the mirror, trying to look unaffected, while in another, a courtier tries to sneak a note past a haughty chaperone. The smells of perfume and burning tallow mix with the sharper tang of fear. Even servants walk carefully, knowing one slip could be overheard by the wrong ear. And then there's Catherine Howard, young, radiant, practically glowing, with naïve charm, but already under scrutiny from eyes that never blink. You can almost feel the invisible threads tugging at her past, her family connections, the whispered stories from her teenage years. Historians still argue whether Catherine truly understood the danger she was stepping into, or whether sheer luck and courtly training had allowed her to survive this long. Quirkily, some courtiers swear that the king has a personal fascination with footwear. He notices the tiniest flaw in a boot or slipper, and rumors say he judges character by toes alone. You might chuckle, but it's a reminder. In Henry's world, small things become deadly significant. Meanwhile, mainstream fact insists that the court is a world of ritualized politeness, elaborate feasts, and carefully staged entertainments, all designed to keep nobles preoccupied, while the king's real power remained absolute. You notice the musicians tuning their lutes in the gallery above, the soft hum of strings providing a false sense of calm. It's a soundtrack for a palace where appearances are everything, and even laughter can be a weapon. Walking further, you brush past painted walls depicting Tudor victories, Henry's victories, and, inevitably, his marriages. One fresco eerily blank, where a former queen once was. The silence in some corridors is heavier than the banquet halls, as though the palace itself is aware of the precarious balances within. You can almost sense the tension of unsaid rivalries. A courtier waiting for gossip to solidify into scandal, or a misstep by a young queen that could cost her everything. Catherine's beauty is undeniable. Her laugh is infectious. Her smile seems to disarm the most skeptical courtiers. But charm, you quickly learn, is a double-edged sword here. One misjudged smile, one ill-timed blush, and the machinery of courtly suspicion might begin grinding relentlessly toward ruin. And yet, for all its danger, there is something mesmerizing about the court. The golden candlelight reflecting off polished armor, the faint scent of roses in the royal gardens, the music wafting from hidden chambers. It all feels like a dream. If a dream you might wake from too late. You probably won't survive long if you ignore the unspoken rules. Who speaks to whom, when a bow is expected, and how many curtsies are safe before someone files it away as insolence. Here, power is visible in embroidered patterns, audible in clipped tones, and tangible in the brush of a silken sleeve across your arm. And Catherine, whether she realizes it yet or not, is about to become a center of this intricate web, a bright thread that could unravel or dazzle. By the end of your first day at Whitehall, you're dizzy with the spectacle, exhausted by the constant calculation, and vaguely terrified by the sense that history is watching, recording each glance, each whisper, each step. In this world, the young and beautiful are both celebrated and scrutinized with equal intensity. Mainstream history remembers Henry VIII as a king of forceful character, a larger-than-life presence on the European stage. Quirky rumors insist he sometimes judged loyalty by who could stand in his shadow without flinching. And amidst all of this, you walk with Catherine Howard in your mind, feeling the first stirrings of what will soon become the tragic, captivating story of her brief, perilous time in the Tudor sun. You follow Catherine Howard back through the palace corridors, past the echoing footsteps and whispers, imagining her life before she ever set foot in Henry VIII's court. She wasn't born into grandeur, at least not the kind that promised safety, but she was a lady of gentle breeding, accustomed to household hierarchies, secret glances, and the subtle power of charm. Her early years are a maze of tutors, strict governesses, and the occasional indulgent relative who lets her peek at courtly delights from afar. You can almost see her in the candlelit hallways of her childhood home, adjusting a ribbon in her hair, feeling the weight of expectations, while secretly dreaming of excitement beyond garden walls. Historians still argue whether Catherine's vivacious personality was shaped more by innate audacity or by the particular pressures of surviving in a crowded household full of older, competitive cousins. By the time she is sent to serve as a lady-in-waiting for older, more politically savvy women, Catherine is already adept at navigating attention. She understands which smiles will earn favor, which silences keep enemies at bay, and which gestures, so small, so fleeting, can convey innocence while hiding ambition. Mainstream accounts tell us that young girls in Tudor England were trained from early childhood in the arts of music, needlework, and conversation, partly to prepare them for advantageous marriages, partly to maintain the household's reputation. Quirkily, some tutors reportedly taught girls how to feign fainting at precisely the right social moments, a performance art designed to elicit protection or admiration from men, skills Catherine would eventually wield, perhaps unknowingly, in the perilous game of courtship. You picture her moving through the drafty rooms of her household, the scent of tallow lamps mingling with fresh bread and lavender, while older relatives lecture her on morality and obedience. The lessons are endless. Curtsy lower, speak softer, never reveal your feelings too quickly. And yet, the very constraints that are meant to mold her also sharpen her instincts. She learns which corners are safest for eavesdropping, how to gauge the mood of a room in half a heartbeat, and how to turn even minor compliments into opportunities for advantage. These are not the glamorous skills of royalty, but survival tools for a girl who might one day encounter kings and courtiers more dangerous than any household rival. Catherine's family, particularly her stepmother, is a study in contradictions. She enforces strict rules, but occasionally shows favoritism, leaving Catherine alternately terrified and exhilarated. You can almost feel the tension crackling in the air as young Catherine tiptoes between rules and rebellion. Historians still argue whether the lack of a stable maternal figure contributed to Catherine's impulsive decisions later, or whether her charm and intelligence were simply innate. Mainstream history notes that her household was one of modest status among the gentry, making her rise to queen all the more remarkable and perilous. Imagine a scene where Catherine sneaks into the garden at dusk, golden light fading over trimmed hedges, her mind buzzing with daydreams of dances and far-off courts. She might hear the distant laughter of servants, the rustle of leaves, the faint pluck of a lute, and think herself clever for imagining she could someday escape the strictures of her youth. Quirky anecdotes suggest she had a penchant for dramatic storytelling, even as a teenager, inventing tales of lovers and knights that amused her peers and occasionally got her into trouble. Already, you sense the duality of her personality, lively, bold, and magnetic, yet constantly negotiating the fine line between charm and scandal. Her first forays into court life are tentative. You can see her balancing a fan in her hand, fluttering her eyes, just so, practicing the small, precise gestures that will later earn the king's notice. Each hallway, each tapestry, each whispering lady-in-waiting becomes a lesson in observation. She notices the rivalries, the subtle barbs disguised as compliments, the carefully timed silences that can ruin or make reputations. She is young, yes, but remarkably attuned to the rhythms of power. Historians still argue whether her early exposure to such intricate social maneuvering instilled resilience or set her up for the dangerous risks she would later take. You imagine her sitting at a window, a needlework hoop in her lap, tracing imaginary paths through Whitehall's labyrinthine halls in her mind. Mainstream accounts say that young ladies in waiting often served as informal spies and messengers, learning court secrets almost by accident. Quirkily, some sources suggest that Catherine delighted in mimicking the older, more experienced courtiers, performing little impressions that made her popular among servants, but possibly caught the wary attention of ambitious rivals. Every glance she stole, every laugh she shared, is a rehearsal for the real stage awaiting her. And then there is her nature, sudden, effervescent, and strikingly candid. She laughs at the wrong moment, blushes with unexpected intensity, and charms strangers as easily as friends. These qualities, innocent in a household setting, carry enormous risk in the wider world of court. You notice how she studies faces, memorizes alliances, and practices the subtlety that seems natural, but is actually the product of years of careful observation. Historians still argue whether her impetuousness was a flaw or simply a youthful strategy, misapplied in a deadly adult world. Catherine's household is full of stories, some whispered, some deliberately shared to assert control. You can hear echoes of past scandals, minor betrayals, and the occasional outright rebellion, all of which Catherine absorbs with a keen, curious mind. Mainstream fact reminds you that Tudor England placed immense importance on reputation, particularly for women of her status, where a single rumor could derail prospects entirely. Quirkily, she reportedly had a fascination with masks and small disguises, a hobby she claimed was for entertainment, but may have subtly trained her to navigate the deceptions of court life. By the time she is introduced formally into the broader circles of the court, you can sense her readiness, a blend of nerves and confidence, awareness of danger, and a magnetic charm that makes her unforgettable. She's a product of her household's lessons, her family's contradictions, and her own ingenuity. In the quiet moments, when the tutors and governesses are gone and the lanterns flicker, she rehearses smiles, conversations, and gestures, unknowingly preparing for a stage that will dwarf even her most ambitious imaginings. This is Catherine Howard before the king notices her, before scandal whispers in her ear, and before the life-altering events begin. The stage is set, the players are waiting, and she is both innocent and cunning. A young lady in waiting, about to step into history. You follow Catherine as she steps deeper into court life, and suddenly, the world feels more like a chessboard than a ballroom. Every smile, every tilt of the head, every flutter of her eyelids is a move in a game you can barely keep track of. You can almost feel the invisible pressure building, the weight of eyes that scrutinize not just what she says, but what she doesn't say. Here, beauty is power, but power is a trap. One wrong glance, and the gossip mills churn into scandal. Historians still argue whether Catherine truly understood the dangers she courted, or if youthful exuberance simply blinded her to them. Mainstream fact tells us that courtly flirtation was almost ritualized in Henry VIII's England, a delicate dance of attraction and social maneuvering that could elevate or destroy in equal measure. Catherine quickly discovers the thrill and danger of attention. Courtiers, aware of her youth and vivacity, circle with smiles and compliments that mask ambition, jealousy, and sometimes more sinister intentions. You can almost feel the hum of whispers as she passes through corridors. Who is she? Is she suitable for the king? Is she clever or reckless? Each question is a thread, weaving a web she must navigate carefully, even as the exhilaration of being noticed pulses through her. Quirkily, some observers claimed Catherine had a knack for memorizing the details of everyone she met. The color of a sleeve, the shape of a hat, so she could later recall them with charming precision. A talent that won admirers and unnerved rivals alike. You watch as Catherine flirts with carelessness, the kind of harmless-seeming laughter and tilt of the head that draws attention without overtly challenging the rules. And yet, even these small gestures carry enormous risk. In a court where allegiances shift like sand, and where a misinterpreted look could become the talk of a week, or a political weapon, she is balancing on a knife's edge. Historians still argue whether her natural charisma was a survival mechanism or an invitation to disaster. But one thing is clear: the young queen-in-waiting is learning quickly that charm can be both shield and spear. Imagine her stepping into a room filled with the richest fabrics, polished armor, and murmured negotiations. Every eye lingers on her, some admiring, others calculating. You can feel the tension in the air, a subtle electric charge that makes even small interactions significant. Mainstream history reminds us that court life was governed by a delicate hierarchy. Knowing whom to speak to, when, and how was as vital as knowing the right curtsy or the proper phrase. Quirkily, Catherine apparently had a fondness for playful pranks, like swapping ornamental fans among ladies-in-waiting or slipping notes into unsuspecting pockets. Small acts that delighted friends, but sometimes irritated more ambitious courtiers. You can see how these traits, innocent or mischievous in a hallway, would later complicate her life in ways she could never anticipate. Her flirtations are not merely innocent amusements. They are practice in the high-stakes game of courtly politics. A tilt of her chin, a quick laugh, the glint of mischief in her eye. All of it is observed, remembered, and catalogued. She senses the currents of power flowing around her, the rivalries simmering just beneath the polite smiles. And then there's Thomas Culpepper, a young courtier whose charm is matched only by ambition. He notices her, and she notices him, not as a threat, not yet, but as a delightful spark in a world where every interaction carries potential consequences. Historians still argue whether their early interactions were truly innocent or already tinged with the beginnings of the affair that would seal her fate. You follow her through late-night gatherings, candlelit galleries, and whispered conversations in corridors too narrow for more than one secret at a time. The smell of tallow lamps, roasted meats, and faint perfume mingles with tension. Courtiers' eyes dart constantly, and Catherine, while cautious, begins to enjoy the thrill of being desired, watched, and envied simultaneously. Mainstream records emphasize that young noblewomen were taught to captivate, but also to protect themselves through subtlety and awareness. Quirkily, Catherine reportedly practiced reading expressions and gestures like a language, predicting reactions before anyone spoke, a skill that served her in playful duels of wit, but failed to protect her from more serious dangers. The game grows more dangerous as gossip swirls, driven by rival factions at court. You can almost hear the soft murmur of speculation. Who has been seen with whom? What letters have been exchanged? Whose loyalty might shift overnight? Every minor indiscretion, every playful glance has the potential to escalate into a scandal that reaches Henry himself. Historians still argue whether Catherine's impulsive responses were naive mistakes or calculated risks taken in an environment where charm was currency. The thrill of attention and the risk of discovery intertwine like two dancers in an intricate Tudor waltz. Beautiful, dangerous, and potentially fatal. And then there's the peculiar culture of courtly play, where jest, flirtation, and spectacle intertwine with politics. Catherine experiments with this, teasing, smiling, navigating attention as if she were learning a complex dance. Except the music is unpredictably fast and sometimes deadly. Mainstream history notes that flirtation was a known, structured part of courtly life, and young women like Catherine were expected to be engaging yet discreet. Quirkily, some sources claim she once orchestrated a harmless mischief involving a stuffed cat that delighted courtiers and amused the king, showing her quick wit and sense of performance. Even light-hearted antics, however, might later be twisted into evidence of impropriety. By the end of this early period, you sense Catherine's duality: cautious yet daring, observant yet impulsive, charming yet dangerously naive. She navigates hallways filled with ambition, intrigue, and hidden envy, aware that every smile is measured, every look dissected, every whisper carries weight. You feel her excitement, the intoxicating mix of power, inattention, alongside a subtle, growing tension. The realization that in Henry's court, the line between admiration and accusation is thinner than a silk ribbon. Her dangerous game has only just begun. You follow Catherine into the heart of the palace, and suddenly, the air seems to trum with a different energy, one that makes the floorboards creak under the weight of anticipation. It's the moment she meets Henry VIII, a king as massive in presence as he is infamous in reputation. You can almost feel the heat radiating from him as he enters a chamber lit by dozens of flickering candles, armor clanking faintly, eyes sharp enough to slice through pretense. Catherine's breath catches, every instinct honed in her years as a lady-in-waiting suddenly sharpens. She is aware, even in this first moment, that her life is about to tilt into a realm where charm, wit, and timing can be as dangerous as a sword. Historians still argue whether Catherine instantly understood the peril of this encounter or simply trusted in the magic of her own allure. Mainstream accounts remind us that Henry, at this point, is in his late 40s, a king who has already executed 2 wives, broken with Rome, and wields absolute power. The chamber smells of beeswax, leather, and a faint tang of the king's personal grooming. Something musky, something deliberate. You can almost see Catherine adjusting her posture, aware that one wrong glance could be remembered forever. Henry's eyes settle on her, and the reaction is immediate. A mixture of curiosity, desire, and the sort of calculating appraisal that only someone who has commanded armies and courts alike can muster. He steps closer, and Catherine's pulse accelerates, not just from fear, but from a heady sense of being noticed by the most powerful man in England. Quirkily, some observers later reported that Henry had a habit of noting the tiniest details: the slope of a shoulder, the cadence of a laugh, even the scent of perfume. and he would mentally catalog them all, storing impressions for the right moment. You imagine the conversation, small talk, wrapped in the formalities of court, subtle compliments, masked by polite phrasing, the delicate probing of a king testing his potential queen. Catherine responds with the confidence she has cultivated over years of observation, her laughter light, her expressions carefully measured. She navigates each line with the dexterity of someone accustomed to reading people. Yet you can almost feel the underlying danger, the sense that Henry is assessing not just beauty, but loyalty, wit, and the potential for misstep. Historians still argue whether Catherine's charm was innate or strategically employed. But the effect on the king is undeniable. As you watch, you notice the courtiers around them shifting like chess pieces, their eyes darting between expressions and gestures, calculating what this encounter might mean for alliances and ambition. The chamber is alive with tension. Even the tapestries seem to shimmer with anticipation. Mainstream history tells us that meetings like this were crucial. A king's first impression could seal a match, a favor, or a death sentence. Quirkily, some chroniclers suggest that Catherine's bright green eyes had an almost hypnotic effect on men of the court, earning her not just admiration, but a subtle aura of danger. Every blink, every turn of the head is observed and interpreted in ways that feel both mundane and deadly consequential. Henry's reaction is complex, a mixture of desire, amusement, and a curious fascination. You can feel it in the room, like static before a storm. He asks questions, tests her responses, and listens with the attention of someone used to having absolute control. Catherine answers with a blend of innocence and sophistication, revealing charm while keeping her vulnerabilities shielded. Historians still argue whether this moment set the tone for her entire tenure as queen, or if it was simply one of many sparks in a court already rife with intrigue. You can almost feel the psychological undercurrent. Catherine recognizes that being noticed by Henry is an extraordinary opportunity, but also a terrifying risk. The slightest misstep, a delayed curtsy, a faltering laugh, could be magnified in a palace eager for gossip. The corridors echo with her footsteps as she leaves the chamber, yet the king's gaze seems to linger, a weight pressing in the spaces between walls. Mainstream accounts describe Henry as both magnetic and intimidating, capable of inspiring devotion and fear in equal measure. Quirky anecdotes suggest he sometimes judged character through quirks. A smile too wide or a bow too deep might be interpreted as disingenuous or dangerously clever. As Catherine departs the room, the courtiers whisper behind their fans, comparing notes and exchanging predictions. You feel the tension lingering, almost like a shadow clinging to her steps. She has survived the first test, yes, but already you sense the undercurrent of peril. Henry's interest is rarely casual, and it is rarely without consequence. Historians still argue whether Catherine's reaction, her mixture of poise and charm, was instinct, training, or a bold gamble that she could manage the king's attention safely. By the end of this encounter, you sense the collision of fates. A young woman, armed with wit and beauty, standing before a king, a man whose desires and suspicions are as formidable as any army. You feel the thrill and fear mingling in the chamber, the same energy that will propel Catherine into a dizzying rise to queenhood, and eventually toward the shadow of scandal. Mainstream history remembers this meeting as decisive. Quirkily, some sources claim Catherine laughed in a way that Henry found singularly delightful. A minor detail that would resonate far longer than anyone in the room could imagine. That single meeting, innocent, dangerous, intoxicating, sets the stage for everything that comes next. You trail Catherine through the whirlwind of courtship, a dizzying blur of candlelit halls, rustling silk, and whispered intrigue. It's not just flirtation anymore. It's a performance, one that must balance charm with caution, beauty with intelligence, and audacity with restraint. The king notices everything, from the way her gown falls to the tilt of her chin, and Catherine navigates each glance with a mixture of grace and thrill. Mainstream accounts tell us that courtship in Tudor England was both intensely personal and fiercely political. Marriage was a tool of state, a matter of dynastic survival, and in Henry's case, a display of absolute power. Quirkily, some observers later commented that Henry kept a collection of little notes about his queen's smiles and laughter, cataloging which gestures delighted him most. A detail that would become oddly significant in Catherine's story. Historians still argue whether Catherine's eagerness to please was genuine affection or a careful maneuver to secure favor in an environment where a misstep could be fatal. The court is alive with preparation for her rise from lady-in-waiting to queen. You can almost hear the frantic bustle, seamstresses at their tables, polishing the delicate lace and embroidery that will mark Catherine's new status. Pages darting through corridors with letters and messages. Advisors whispering behind heavy tapestries about the political ramifications of the impending marriage. The smell of candle smoke mixes with fresh ink and the faint tang of perfumed powder, giving every hallway a sense of anticipation and tension. Catherine herself moves through it with a calculated mixture of poise and excitement, aware that each bow, each smile, each careful laugh is scrutinized, remembered, and interpreted. You witness the lavishness of Tudor courtship, banquets where dishes arrive in layers of showmanship, musicians playing in perfect harmony, and nobles in gleaming attire competing for the king's attention. Catherine is at the center of it, radiant and magnetic, yet quietly noting the subtleties of power and alliance around her. Mainstream history records that the king's court was one of spectacle and ritual, designed to impress, intimidate, and subtly remind everyone present who held ultimate authority. Quirkily, some chroniclers report that Catherine delighted in the theater of courtly life, occasionally orchestrating little pranks or playful interactions that endeared her to some and irritated others. Tiny displays of personality that would later be remembered, twisted, or misinterpreted. As courtship intensifies, Catherine experiences the intoxicating thrill of being desired, pursued, and praised. She navigates whispered compliments, strategic glances, and carefully worded letters with a growing confidence that seems almost effortless. Yet, even in the midst of these dizzying social dances, you sense the underlying danger. Henry's attention is a volatile force, unpredictable and sometimes explosive. Historians still argue whether Catherine's youth and vivacity made her more vulnerable to his whims, or whether they simply intensified the king's fascination with her. Every moment, every gesture is potentially consequential, and Catherine is acutely aware that the rules of engagement are subtle, complex, and unforgiving. Finally, the wedding approaches, an event of extraordinary ceremony and grandeur. You can feel the palace trembling with anticipation, the scent of polished wood, burning tallow, and perfumed flowers filling every corridor, the soft rustle of silks and satins mingling with the murmur of advisors, courtiers, and servants, the quiet but relentless rhythm of footsteps, preparing the stage for history. Catherine stands before the altar, radiant and nervous, fully aware that her life is about to change irrevocably. Mainstream fact notes that royal weddings were not only personal milestones, but also public displays of power and legitimacy, designed to reinforce dynastic authority and social hierarchy. Quirkily, some chroniclers mention that Catherine's favorite jewel, a delicate gold pendant, was strategically displayed during the ceremony, perhaps as an innocent act of vanity or as a subtle signal to certain courtiers. Either way, it was remembered as part of her visual allure. As she takes her vows, you feel the tension and thrill mingling in equal measure. Henry's gaze lingers, the court watches intently, and Catherine steps fully into her role as queen. Every subtle movement, every carefully measured word, every blink carries weight. You sense that she understands, perhaps instinctively, that she has achieved the pinnacle of visibility, where admiration and scrutiny are inseparable. Historians still argue whether Catherine's apparent joy was genuine happiness, clever manipulation, or a mix of both. The newlywed queen is immediately swept into her duties and rituals, attending banquets, receiving ambassadors, learning the intricate etiquette required of a Tudor queen, and navigating the hidden rivalries and alliances within the court. You can almost feel the pressure building around her, like air tightening before a storm. Mainstream history emphasizes that Henry's queens were under intense scrutiny, their every word and action examined for loyalty, intelligence, and virtue. Quirkily, Catherine reportedly had a playful fondness for music and dance, which she used both to charm the king and to relieve the stress of her new, demanding role. You sense that the thrill of courtship has not faded. It has transformed into the constant vigilance required of a queen. Catherine's awareness of her position, her beauty, and her power intensifies. Every smile, every gesture, every glance at Henry is a balancing act, performed under the watchful eyes of courtiers who are simultaneously envious, loyal, and opportunistic. You realize that while the wedding marks the culmination of her rise, it also signals the beginning of a much more dangerous game, one that requires charm, intelligence, and a keen sense of self-preservation. Historians still argue whether her natural vivacity, which had brought her to Henry's attention, would be a source of strength or a fatal vulnerability. In these early days of her queenship, you walk alongside Catherine through glittering halls and candlelit chambers, feeling the intoxicating mix of triumph, danger, and fragile security. She moves with grace and confidence, Yet you can sense the tension beneath the surface. The awareness that the court is a living organism, capable of elevating and destroying with equal ease. Mainstream history remembers this period as a dazzling ascent for a young queen. Quirkily, some letters from courtiers hint that her laughter could soften even the sternest faces, an almost magical quality that earned her fleeting adoration. Yet beneath the gold and silk, the subtle currents of envy, rivalry, and latent danger are already at work, waiting for a single misstep to transform charm into catastrophe. You follow Catherine as she steps fully into the dizzying world of Whitehall, where grandeur and menace intertwine so seamlessly that you can feel it pressing in from all sides. The corridors are polished, the chandeliers glint, and the tapestries hum with stories of kings, battles, and queens long gone. But beneath all that gilded splendor lies a shadowy rhythm, a subtle tension treading every step she takes. Court life is never just about appearances. It's about survival, observation, and understanding that one careless gesture can ripple into ruin. Mainstream history tells us that Tudor courtiers lived in constant vigilance, their daily routines dominated by ritualized etiquette, displays of loyalty, and strategic attention. Quirkily, some contemporaries whispered that certain court corners were considered unlucky, so courtiers avoided them, believing spirits or misfortune lingered there. A superstition that even young Catherine couldn't entirely dismiss. Historians still argue whether these rituals and superstitions were protective strategies or simply tools for reinforcing the king's omnipresent authority. You can almost hear the soft shuffle of skirts and the clink of buckles as Catherine navigates the corridors, acutely aware that she is always being watched. Every curtsy, every smile, every glance is calculated to please Henry, while not giving potential rivals a foothold. The daily rhythm is relentless. Mornings filled with audiences, afternoons with lessons in protocol, evenings with feasts and performances where every word spoken could be scrutinized and remembered. Even walking across a room carries weight. The tilt of a head or the way a hand brushes against fabric might become fodder for gossip. Catherine's youth, beauty, and vivacity make her magnetic, but also a target. The palace smells are intoxicating and disorienting. The wax of candles mixed with the faint tang of roasted meats, perfumes, and the lingering scent of polished wood. These sensory details, small as they may seem, remind you constantly of the layers of life in Whitehall. Luxury overlaying anxiety, opulence masking peril. Catherine moves gracefully through this labyrinth, aware of invisible currents. Who is watching? Who envies? Who waits for a misstep? Mainstream accounts emphasize that the Queen's household was a microcosm of court politics, filled with both allies and spies, and every interaction held potential consequences. Quirkily, some courtiers claimed that Catherine would sometimes leave tiny notes hidden in the folds of her skirts, reminders for allies or playful jabs at friends, acts of subtle rebellion in an environment that demanded absolute conformity. The social dynamics are intricate, almost theatrical. You can picture Catherine attending private teas with ladies-in-waiting, participating in needlework circles and listening carefully while older women exchange cryptic observations. You notice how she balances warmth with caution, charm with strategy, and spontaneity with decorum. Even small victories, a well-received joke, a glance returned appropriately, a polite deflection, carry immense significance. Historians still argue whether Catherine's success in navigating these early court interactions was the product of innate skill, careful observation, or just fortunate timing. Beyond the visible social structure, Whitehall is full of shadows. Corridors seem to whisper secrets, tapestries hide listening ears, and courtiers exchange coded signals that you, an outsider, almost feel but can't fully interpret. You imagine Catherine sensing these unseen networks, noting alliances and rivalries, mapping loyalties in her mind like a chessboard. Mainstream history notes that espionage, rumor, and surveillance were integral to Tudor court life, and even the Queen herself could not move entirely unobserved. Quirkily, some contemporaneous letters hint that Catherine enjoyed testing these dynamics, subtly observing reactions to her words or gestures as if rehearsing for larger social gambits. The pressures of daily life are relentless. Catherine is learning to manage servants, advisors, and nobles while maintaining a composed exterior before the king. You can almost feel her heartbeat quicken as she senses tension in a room, hears a whispered remark meant for someone else, or catches a glance that signals disapproval. Every step is an exercise in poise and perception. Historians still argue whether the constant scrutiny enhanced her social intelligence or contributed to impulsive decisions later. A subtle mix of skill and youthful misjudgment shaping her trajectory. You sense the subtle games at work, minor slights, overlooked invitations, favors given or withheld, all designed to shift influence in the court. Catherine, for all her charm, is now fully aware that her life as queen is not solely defined by Henry's favor, but by her ability to negotiate these hidden networks. Mainstream accounts emphasize that this tension between personal desire and political necessity was a defining feature of Tudor queenship. Quirkily, some memoirs suggest she sometimes practiced facial expressions in secret, a theatrical rehearsal for the micro moments that could convey wit, charm, or innocence, depending on the audience. A skill both charming and perilous. Even the simplest acts are fraught with consequence. Descending a staircase too quickly, curtsying incorrectly, or laughing at the wrong joke can attract scrutiny or resentment. Catherine learns to modulate her presence, balancing openness with reserve, approachability with authority. You feel the weight of this constant vigilance, as though the walls themselves are extensions of the court's watchful eyes. Historians still argue whether Catherine's lively personality was a protective advantage in this environment or a vulnerability that made her a target for gossip and political machinations. By the end of these early months, you can sense Catherine's transformation. She is still young and impulsive, yet she has learned to navigate the subtle currents of Whitehall with growing awareness. Every hallway, every whispered word, every curtsy is part of a vast, invisible game. The palace is both stage and trap, and Catherine moves through it like a dancer, aware of her beauty, charm, and potential power, but equally aware that the shadows can swallow her whole if missteps accumulate. Mainstream history paints this period as formative, teaching her both the seductions and perils of courtly life. Quirkily, some letters hint that Catherine occasionally paused to watch sunlight hitting the tapestries, finding fleeting moments of serenity amidst the ever-present tension. The Whitehall shadows are long, and her dance within them has only begun. You follow Catherine deeper into the intricate web of court life, where every smile, glance, and whispered word carries weight, and the palace walls seem to hum with secrets. By now, she has learned to navigate Whitehall's rituals and hierarchies, but a new, far more dangerous element has entered her world: the undercurrent of past indiscretions and present flirtations. You can almost feel the electric tension in every room she passes, the awareness that people talk when they think they're unheard, that minor gestures can be twisted into scandal. Mainstream history reminds us that young noblewomen at Tudor courts were constantly observed. Gossip and rumor often carried as much power as official decrees. Quirkily, some courtiers claimed Catherine had a knack for memorizing which corridors were safest for private conversations, and she sometimes used these routes for clandestine chats, unaware that hidden observers might already be cataloging her every step. Historians still argue whether Catherine's early relationships were naive flirtations or deliberate experiments in testing her personal charm and power. You imagine her encounters with young men at court, subtle dances of interest and retreat, the kind of attention that brings both excitement and peril. Thomas Culpepper's eyes occasionally find hers across the room. A casual brush of hands in a crowded gallery sends a thrill racing through her, and yet she knows the stakes are higher than ever. Every gesture could be recorded in memory and later recounted to the king, or twisted into evidence of impropriety. Mainstream accounts stress that flirtation was often ritualized, a social currency that young women were taught to wield carefully. But in Catherine's case, the balance is precarious, and the potential for misinterpretation enormous. Quirkily, contemporary gossip suggested she sometimes whispered playful riddles to chosen courtiers, a harmless amusement that entertained some and scandalized others. The undercurrents of her past also begin to surface. You can almost feel the tension in her chest as letters, secrets, and previous relationships come into focus. While her beauty and wit win admiration, whispers of improprieties from her teenage years follow her, carried by servants, relatives, and rival courtiers alike. The contrast between public charm and private missteps creates a constant, simmering anxiety that she must learn to manage. Historians still argue whether these youthful indiscretions were genuinely harmful or simply amplified by a court eager for scandal. Mainstream history recounts that Catherine had connections with multiple young men before her marriage, a fact that becomes significant when the court begins to probe her past. You can almost feel her heart quicken during moments of intimate conversation in shadowed galleries, the thrill of secrecy mingling with the knowledge of potential consequences. Courtiers' eyes flit constantly, measuring and cataloging interactions. Even the slightest flirtation, a lingering glance, a whispered joke, can ripple outward, altering alliances, fueling jealousy, and feeding rumor. Quirkily, some letters suggest Catherine would occasionally exchange small tokens, handkerchiefs, embroidered gloves, or miniature charms with select admirers. Innocent gestures that nevertheless became part of the tapestry of suspicion surrounding her. As these relationships deepen, the court becomes a minefield of observation. You sense the invisible networks, servants who report what they see, rivals who interpret innocuous gestures as schemes, and advisors who watch for any sign of impropriety. Catherine's natural vivacity both draws attention and endangers her. She moves like a moth in candlelight, alluring and at risk of being consumed. Historians still argue whether she could have avoided scandal entirely, or whether her charm inevitably attracted scrutiny that no amount of caution could deflect. The tension is compounded by Henry's unpredictable temperament. You can almost feel the shadow of his gaze in every corridor, the awareness that the king's favor is fickle, and the line between playful attention and serious accusation is razor thin. Catherine's flirtations, while seemingly harmless, exist within a structure that magnifies the smallest misstep. Mainstream accounts emphasize that Tudor queens were judged not just by their conduct in the present, but by the rumors and associations of their past, a relentless form of scrutiny that Catherine cannot escape. Quirkily, some sources hint she once staged playful, accidental meetings with courtiers to amuse herself, unaware that even these staged moments could be twisted into evidence of moral failing. You can almost feel the psychological strain of balancing desire, charm, and survival. Every gesture toward a favorite courtier must be calculated, a touch on the hand, a joke shared across the room, or a lingering smile. All could be observed, remembered, and reported. Catherine's innate warmth and vivacity, qualities that endear her to many, become double-edged swords in a court, where virtue and reputation are constantly under siege. Historians still argue whether her impulsive gestures were youthful indiscretions or calculated maneuvers in a sophisticated social game. By the end of this period, you sense the growing web of peril. Catherine has learned to navigate attention and desire, but she has also become entangled in rumors, past liaisons, and the ceaseless observation of those around her. The thrill of flirtation is inseparable from the danger it brings. Every smile, every whispered word, every hidden glance carries consequences that ripple far beyond her immediate awareness. Mainstream history records that these early relationships laid the groundwork for the scandal that would ultimately define her brief queenship. Quirkily, some observers noted that her laughter, light, and musical could disarm even suspicious courtiers, a charm that saved her in small ways, but could not shield her from the larger currents of courtly intrigue. Catherine stands at the center of this swirling mix of allure, peril, and observation, feeling both the intoxicating rush of attention and the looming threat of exposure. You can almost sense the delicate balance she maintains between private desire and public expectation. The thin line separating fascination from judgment and the quiet, persistent awareness that one misstep could alter the course of her life irrevocably. The secrets and affairs are more than personal. They are part of a dangerous game, a high-stakes dance that only begins here. You feel the atmosphere shift as whispers begin to coil through Whitehall. Carrying a secret so delicate, it feels like it might dissolve at a touch. It's a single letter, folded neatly, scented faintly with perfume, yet weighted with the consequences heavier than Catherine herself might fully grasp. You can almost see her hands tremble as it reaches her, the edges crisp, but the words inside capable of shifting her life from a thrilling game to a perilous trap. Historians still argue whether the letter was deliberately sent by an enemy seeking to entangle her, or simply a misjudged communication that spiraled out of control. Mainstream accounts record that letters at Tudor courts were both private and potent, capable of preserving affection, or just as easily, igniting scandal. Quirkily, some contemporary sources suggest that courtiers sometimes used invisible ink, hidden compartments, or playful ciphers in their correspondence. Tiny inventions meant for discretion, but occasionally discovered with explosive consequences. You watch Catherine unfold the note, her pulse quickening. The words are intimate, perhaps affectionate, perhaps bold, but their implications are immediate. They risk revealing connections from her past, entangling her in a web that Henry himself might someday read. The palace seems to shrink around her, the chandeliers flickering as if in anticipation, shadows dancing along tapestries that conceal as much as they reveal. Mainstream history emphasizes that Henry VIII's court operated on a razor's edge. Letters, gestures, and overheard conversations could all become instruments of political and personal peril. Quirkily, some chroniclers claim that a particularly elaborate piece of stationery, complete with intricate wax seals, once provoked Henry's curiosity to the point of obsession, showing how even minor details could escalate consequences. You feel Catherine's mind racing. Every interaction with Thomas Culpeper and other familiar figures is suddenly reframed. Every smile, every meeting, every playful note now carries an unspoken question mark. Historians still argue whether Catherine grasped the full danger immediately, or whether she treated it initially as an extension of her usual flirtations, unaware that the stakes were exponentially higher now. Mainstream accounts note that her early letters, often innocent or coquettish in intent, were suddenly scrutinized under a lens of suspicion and moral expectation far beyond what she had ever imagined. The palace corridors take on a new tension. You can almost hear the whispers behind tapestries, the subtle rustle of servants passing urgent notes, the quiet glance of a rival who has caught a hint of impropriety. Catherine walks among them, outwardly poised but inwardly aware that her every move is now being measured against the knowledge contained in that single letter. Quirkily, some courtiers enjoyed dramatic readings of letters in private, using them to test reactions or to tease, oblivious to the danger they might inadvertently create. Catherine, you sense, begins to understand that even playful correspondence can no longer be regarded as harmless. You follow her as she ponders her next steps, trying to reconcile affection, loyalty, and self-preservation. The letter is both an echo of past desire and a potential weapon in the court's complex political games. Every word she has written, every response she has given, could be seized, interpreted, and used against her. Historians still argue whether Catherine's handling of this correspondence reflects youthful naivety, boldness, or a combination of both, and whether her choices at this stage were mistakes or inevitable outcomes of her courtly environment. The consequences of this single piece of parchment ripple outward. Courtiers begin to take note of her interactions. Rumors gain traction, and attention sharpens to a dangerous edge. You can feel the invisible pressure mounting. The palace itself seems to breathe. Corridors narrowing, tapestries closing in, as if the walls were aware of the coming storm. Mainstream history reminds us that letters were crucial instruments of both romance and political maneuvering, often remembered long after the events themselves had passed. Quirkily, some letters were even misdelivered or intercepted, turning trivial affection into scandal simply through circumstance. A reminder that in this world, luck was as crucial as caution. Catherine must now navigate the treacherous space between personal desire and public scrutiny. You sense the tension as she weighs trust, discretion, and survival. Which courtiers can be confided in, which steps can be taken safely, and how to continue displaying charm and poise without revealing her vulnerability. Historians still argue whether her decisions at this moment were impulsive or calculated. But one thing is clear. The letter has altered the trajectory of her life, transforming flirtation into something far riskier and far more consequential. Even small gestures carry amplified meaning. You watch her adjust a sleeve, smile at a passing courtier, or accept a flower from a servant. All seemingly trivial acts, now read as signs of character and morality, potentially influencing opinion at the highest levels. The palace hums with observation. Every corridor, every shadow, every subtle movement might be recorded in memory and reported to the king or a rival. Mainstream accounts note that these micro moments were critical in establishing reputation, especially for a young queen. While quirkily, some letters suggest Catherine used playful symbolism in her notes. Tiny hearts, little drawings that might have been intended for amusement, but could also be misconstrued. By the end of this pivotal moment, you feel the gravity of the letter's impact. Catherine's life, once guided by charm and instinct, now enters a realm where the slightest misstep, the faintest hint of indiscretion, can shift favor into suspicion, affection into accusation. The elegant halls of Whitehall seem suddenly more menacing, and every glance, every gesture carries the weight of history in the making. You can almost sense the first ripples of the scandal that will eventually engulf her. The beginnings of a story in which one letter will play an outsized role, shaping events far beyond her immediate awareness. The letter has changed everything, and the dance between desire, danger, and courtly observation has entered a new, precarious phase. You feel the walls of Whitehall closing in, not physically, but in a way that makes every step, every turn, every breath feel observed. Catherine has learned that nothing is private, Not her laughter, not her letters, not even the faint tilt of her head. The courtier's eyes are everywhere, cataloging, interpreting, and speculating. You can almost hear the soft rustle of silk and the faint clatter of shoes as spies and rivals track every movement. Historians still argue whether the intensity of surveillance at Henry VIII's court was uniquely oppressive or simply par for the course among European courts. Mainstream history tells us that court life was saturated with observation. Servants reported minor transgressions. Ladies-in-waiting watched each other for signs of favor. And even the king had his own network of informants. Quirkily, some courtiers claimed that mirrors were strategically placed in hallways and chambers, allowing subtle glimpses into rooms where private conversations were thought to occur. Almost as if the walls themselves were watching. You follow Catherine as she moves through the great halls, acutely aware of every gaze. Each curtsy, each tilt of the head, each flutter of an eyelash could be noted and later recounted in whispers or letters. You can feel the tension pressing against her chest, the constant need to balance charm with caution. Even small interactions, a whispered joke with a friend, the brief touch of a hand, carry implications that could ripple through the palace. Mainstream accounts emphasize that ladies-in-waiting often served as both companions and inadvertent informants, a dual role that made intimacy risky. Quirkily, some contemporaries suggested that Catherine would sometimes play subtle games, observing reactions and noting who lingered too long or seemed overly curious. A form of counter-surveillance in a palace filled with eyes. The palace corridors, once dazzling and inviting, now feel labyrinthine and fraught. You can almost hear the quiet footsteps behind tapestries, the soft giggles and murmurs that carry farther than anyone expects. Catherine's awareness sharpens. She notes every alliance, rivalry, and subtle glance. Historians still argue whether her heightened vigilance in these early months was instinctive survival or a conscious strategy to navigate a treacherous social environment. Mainstream records indicate that spies, eavesdroppers, and the king's agents were integral to courtly life, with even minor observations capable of shaping favor or fueling accusations. You sense the psychological pressure mounting. Every social gathering is a performance. Every smile is scrutinized. Every word measured. Catherine's charm, vivacity, and intelligence become both armor and target, attracting attention that can be as dangerous as it is flattering. Quirkily, some observers noted that she developed a keen sense for detecting double meanings and hidden intentions, a skill that occasionally allowed her to predict gossip before it spread. Yet, despite her acumen, you can feel that complete control is impossible. The eyes are simply too many, and the potential for misinterpretation too high. Even private moments are subject to scrutiny. You follow her into the more secluded parts of the palace, where shadows and dim candlelight might provide cover, only to realize that servants, courtiers, and even musicians are trained to notice subtleties. A whispered conversation in a corner, a hastily closed door, a fleeting expression. Anything can be remembered and reported. Historians still argue whether this level of surveillance created a paranoid environment or simply reinforced the strict social order of Henry's court. Mainstream accounts suggest that queens often had to live in a constant state of self-monitoring, aware that Henry's displeasure could be swift and irreversible. You can almost feel the social chessboard shifting under Catherine's feet. Courtiers watch her, not just for herself, but for what her behavior indicates about the king's favor. The palace operates on multiple layers of observation: admiration, envy, political calculation, and sometimes simple curiosity. Quirkily, some letters from contemporaries hint that Catherine could occasionally exploit this attention, using playful smiles or gestures to misdirect or charm observers. A subtle manipulation of the ever-watchful court. The stress of constant observation affects her demeanor. You notice the careful balance she maintains between openness and reserve, warmth and discretion. Every gesture, from a curtsy to a laughter shared, is weighed for potential interpretation. Mainstream history reminds us that for Tudor queens, reputation and appearance were as vital as actual deeds, and maintaining both required relentless vigilance. Historians still argue whether Catherine's ability to navigate these pressures was remarkable skill or simply youthful luck. By the end of this period, you feel the omnipresence of the eyes around her, a force almost tangible in its intensity. Catherine moves like a dancer on a stage, where every move is recorded, every whisper is amplified, and every glance carries significance. You can sense the subtle anxiety that underlies her charm, the tension between desire and discretion, and the heavy burden of being constantly observed. Quirkily, some sources suggest she occasionally rehearsed interactions or expressions in mirrors, anticipating the interpretations of unseen observers. A small, almost theatrical attempt at control in a world dominated by scrutiny. The palace has become a living organism, a web of perception, gossip, and power, and Catherine is at its center. You sense that every interaction, every smile, every carefully measured word is part of an ongoing negotiation with those around her. And with history itself, mainstream accounts portray this as a period of intense learning, where survival and social intelligence are inseparable. Historians still argue whether the constant vigilance she exercised would ultimately protect her or contribute to the vulnerabilities that later ensnared her. In this hall of mirrors and shadows, the young queen learns that the eyes of Whitehall are everywhere, and the consequences of being watched can be as subtle or as deadly as the flick of a fan. You feel the tension snap into something sharper, more immediate, as the first confrontations start to ripple through the corridors of Whitehall. Whispers that were once subtle now gain a bite. Glances turn into pointed questions, and every smile is measured against suspicion. Catherine can almost feel the weight pressing against her chest, a subtle but relentless force, as though the very walls of the palace are pressing in to judge her. Historians still argue whether these early confrontations were inevitable results of her behavior or deliberate moves by enemies eager to entrap her. Mainstream accounts indicate that Tudor courts thrived on conflict and competition, with courtiers eager to curry favor by reporting indiscretions or exaggerating missteps. Quirkily, some sources suggest that certain courtiers kept informal incident logs, recording even the smallest breaches of etiquette, as though cataloging minor errors might one day secure their own advantage. You follow Catherine through a gathering where the first real questions emerge. Subtle barbs are disguised as polite inquiries. Murmured doubts about her past affairs filter through curt conversation. Letters once private are subtly referenced by those seeking leverage. Every gesture is scrutinized, every laugh analyzed. You can almost feel the invisible currents of power shift with each comment, as allies and rivals alike attempt to position themselves. Mainstream history notes that confrontation in Tudor courts often started quietly, with innuendo and subtle implication rather than overt accusation, yet the consequences could be just as severe. Quirkily, some observers commented that Catherine's responses often involved playful deflection or wit, a method that won her temporary reprieve, but sometimes fueled further suspicion. The confrontations aren't only verbal. You sense the body language, the small movements that communicate challenge or reproach. A raised eyebrow, a half smile, a deliberate pause before speaking. Catherine becomes acutely aware that these micro signals can carry more weight than words themselves. Historians still argue whether her apparent composure in these moments was genuine confidence or carefully cultivated performance to mask fear. Mainstream accounts emphasize that a queen's ability to navigate such subtleties could determine her survival in a court rife with political and personal intrigue. You watch the ripples extend to her closest companions, even her ladies-in-waiting, loyal though they may seem, are caught between affection, duty, and the pressure of observation. Every whisper could become evidence. Every hesitation could be interpreted as guilt. Catherine senses that the smallest miscalculation could escalate quickly, and she starts learning to read not just words, but intentions. Quirkily, some letters hint that she occasionally used humor or light-hearted teasing to disarm critics, a tactic that sometimes worked brilliantly and sometimes backfired spectacularly. As the confrontations build, you feel the intensity rise. Courtiers, emboldened by the king's curiosity or by the possibility of advancement, begin pressing questions, probing for inconsistencies, and testing loyalties. Catherine must maneuver through a delicate dance, acknowledging concern without admitting wrongdoing, showing charm without seeming frivolous, maintaining dignity while navigating threats. Mainstream history stresses that the Tudor court operated as a minefield, where perception was often more important than fact. Historians still argue whether Catherine's natural vivacity ultimately left her more exposed, or whether it was her only effective shield in an environment that prized wit and display. You can almost hear the mental calculations running through her mind. How to respond to a pointed remark from an advisor. How to handle a subtle insinuation from a lady-in-waiting. How to maintain Henry's favor while protecting herself from gossip. Every action is measured against the invisible ledger of reputation, a record written and rewritten by the eyes of the court. Quirkily, some chroniclers report that Catherine sometimes used subtle physical cues, a gentle touch of the hand, a tilt of the head, to convey innocence or amusement, techniques that were risky but demonstrated her growing sophistication in courtly diplomacy. Even the king begins to notice these undercurrents. You sense Henry's temperament can swing from amusement to suspicion, and any hint of impropriety or miscalculation may draw scrutiny. Mainstream accounts confirm that his awareness of courtly dynamics was acute and often mercurial. One day, a gesture might delight him. The next, it could provoke anger. You can almost feel Catherine adjusting constantly, an internal choreography of charm, caution, and instinct. Historians still argue whether Henry's early attentiveness to her conduct was protective, curious, or an early warning of the dangers that would later engulf her. The confrontations, subtle though they are, leave a tangible tension in every corridor. You sense that the palace itself seems quieter, waiting for the next move, the next whisper, the next misstep. Catherine, despite her growing skill at navigation and performance, cannot entirely escape the scrutiny. Quirkily, some letters suggest she sometimes rehearsed conversations or responses aloud, as though practicing survival strategies in miniature, aware that even minor miscalculations could carry lasting consequences. By the end of this phase, the pattern is clear. Catherine is surrounded by eyes, ears, and judgments, and every gesture has weight. You can almost feel the invisible net tightening around her, the subtle but persistent pressure that transforms charm into liability. Mainstream history paints these early confrontations as formative, shaping her responses, her self-awareness, and her strategies in the courtly maze. Historians still argue whether her responses were sufficient or if they simply postponed inevitable scrutiny. In this environment, you realize, every smile and every step is a confrontation in itself, a test that Catherine must pass daily in order to survive. You can almost feel the tension in the air snap like a drawn bow as Henry's fury makes its first unmistakable presence known. The king's temper is legendary, a force that can transform whispered rumors into immediate peril. Catherine sensed it in the tightening of the court, the sudden silence as she passes, the way nobles exchange cautious glances before speaking. Mainstream history confirms that Henry VIII could swing from charm to rage with alarming speed, and his queens were often the first to feel the sting of his displeasure. Quirkily, some contemporaries noted that he sometimes used playful or exaggerated gestures, throwing a glove onto a table, stomping a foot, to communicate anger without immediate formal punishment, a theatricality that could unsettle even seasoned courtiers. Historians still argue whether Henry's early warning signs toward Catherine were predictable reactions to missteps or precursors to the relentless scrutiny that would later engulf her. You follow Catherine as the first signs of tension manifest in her daily interactions. The king's glances are sharper now, his questions more pointed, and casual conversations carry an undertone of evaluation. You can almost feel the invisible weight pressing down. The awareness that one misjudged word or glance could shift favor to disfavor in an instant. Mainstream accounts highlight that Tudor queens often navigated a fine line between pleasing the king and maintaining dignity, with missteps magnified under the intense observation of courtiers and advisors. Quirkily, some letters suggest that Catherine's vivid expressions and lively gestures, once charming, were now sometimes interpreted as impertinence, a misreading that could provoke the king's wrath. The fury is not just abstract. You can see it ripple through Whitehall. Courtiers scurry, conversations hush, and Catherine's inner circle grows tense as they attempt to anticipate Henry's next move. Every meal, every gathering, every audience is a potential trial, a stage where perception and reality intermingle dangerously. Historians still argue whether Catherine could have mitigated these early sparks of anger, or whether her youthful vivacity inevitably clashed with Henry's mercurial temperament. Mainstream accounts emphasize that queens were under constant evaluation, with even minor behavior interpreted through a lens of moral, political, and social consequence. You feel Catherine's mind racing, aware that charm and grace alone are no longer sufficient armor. Subtle strategies are needed, carefully measured words, gestures calibrated to display humility without weakness, and avoidance of any hint that might trigger further displeasure. Quirkily, some chroniclers report that she sometimes employed playful distractions, offering music, dance, or poetry to temper Henry's anger, an almost theatrical attempt at emotional diplomacy that sometimes succeeded, sometimes failed. Henry's fury is both unpredictable and instructive. You can sense the way the court shifts in response, the invisible cues from advisors and peers that guide her behavior, the subtle signals that tell her when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to retreat. Mainstream history notes that the intensity of royal scrutiny was magnified by Henry's personal investment in his queen's conduct, and that displeasure could have immediate and lasting consequences. Historians still argue whether Catherine fully understood the dangerous threshold she was approaching, or if her youthful optimism blinded her to the risk. You can almost feel the psychological weight of being constantly evaluated by a man whose favor is both coveted and perilous. Every interaction, from the smallest curtsy to a fleeting glance, must be calibrated to avoid offense, yet maintain the charm and allure that initially attracted Henry. Quirkily, some letters hint that Catherine experimented with subtle expressions, slight changes in posture, carefully timed smiles, delicate touches to modulate his reactions, a delicate balancing act between obedience and personal expression. The fury does not exist in isolation. It reverberates through the court. Courtiers who notice the king's displeasure adjust their behavior, while rivals may see opportunity in her tentative missteps. You can sense Catherine's awareness sharpening the constant mental calculations she must perform to navigate this volatile environment. Mainstream accounts stress that Queens' reputations were fragile, and Henry's anger could tip a precarious social balance in an instant. Historians still argue whether the climate of fear fostered by his fury, contributed to Catherine's later decisions, or merely revealed vulnerabilities that would have existed regardless. You follow her through tense audiences, meals, and private moments, feeling the subtle pressure of Henry's expectations and the heightened awareness of every courtier. The palace feels smaller, heavier, suffused with the energy of scrutiny and potential censure. Quirkily, some contemporaries suggested that Catherine developed small rituals, adjusting a pendant, smoothing a sleeve, or pausing before speaking, as a method to maintain composure and influence perception in the face of royal anger. By the end of this phase, you sense a transformation in Catherine's behavior. Her vivacity remains, but it is tempered by caution, her playful gestures replaced by careful observation. You can almost feel the invisible tension between charm and caution, shaping her every step, every word, every glance. Mainstream history records this period as a crucial moment in her brief queenship, where the king's fury imposed a new layer of awareness and strategic thinking. Historians still argue whether this early friction would have been survivable with different choices, or if it was the beginning of an inevitable descent. Catherine is learning, perhaps too late, that in Henry's court, delight and danger are inseparable companions, and every smile now carries risk, as well as power. You feel the palace shift as tension becomes tangible, almost tactile, like the air itself has thickened with anticipation and dread. Catherine, once moving through corridors with charm and confidence, now senses an invisible hand tightening around her life. The arrest is sudden in its execution, yet inevitable in its logic. A mixture of rumor, evidence, and the king's volatile temper coalesces into a decisive action that will redefine every corner of Whitehall. Mainstream history confirms that Catherine Howard was formally arrested in November 1541, accused of adultery, a charge that would seal her fate. Quirkily, some contemporaneous sources note that the servants involved in such arrests sometimes practiced an almost ceremonial dramatization, ensuring the Queen's apprehension was both public and laden with psychological weight. Historians still argue whether the swiftness of her arrest reflected clear evidence or was propelled by courtly machinations, eager to prove loyalty to Henry. You can almost feel Catherine's pulse quicken as the word reaches her chambers. Courtiers' faces, once neutral or friendly, now betray anxiety, curiosity, or even concealed satisfaction. Every glance feels loaded. Every servant's step echoes like a drum beat, heralding the end of her freedom. Mainstream accounts indicate that arrests of queens were meticulously orchestrated. Men loyal to the crown would approach with precise authority, ensuring there was no room for resistance. Quirkily, some letters describe minor mishaps during arrests, like tripping over lavish skirts or accidentally knocking over objects, humanizing moments that were otherwise fraught with drama and dread. You follow her as the guards enter, their expressions carefully neutral, their hands steady yet deliberate. Catherine, young and still processing the implications, faces the sudden reality that charm, wit, and favor can no longer shield her. Every courtier becomes an observer, some with pity, others with judgment, all participating in an unspoken theater of power and morality. Historians still argue whether Catherine's demeanor during her arrest, reported as composed and graceful, was genuine courage or a desperate performance to maintain dignity in the face of overwhelming peril. Mainstream history emphasizes that the arrest was a public and symbolic assertion of the king's authority, a message to all who might challenge his expectations of queenship. The palace corridors, usually alive with gossip and music, now seem elongated, shadowed, almost suffocating. You can almost hear the whispers multiplying. She knew too much. Her past was hidden no longer. What will Henry do next? Catherine moves carefully, every footstep heavy with the knowledge that the walls themselves are witness. Quirkily, some anecdotes mention that certain servants or minor courtiers found subtle ways to signal loyalty or sympathy during such tense moments. Small nods, avoided eye contact, even discreet gestures of comfort. Tiny acts that contrast sharply with the grandeur and fear surrounding the arrest. You sense the mixture of fear and disbelief coursing through Catherine. The vibrant, lively girl who once laughed and charmed is now forced to confront the reality of her vulnerability. Her previous flirtations, letters, and perceived indiscretions have culminated in this moment, and the palace itself seems to acknowledge the gravity. Tapestries rustle faintly, as if in mourning. Candles flicker, and the shadows in the corners grow longer. Historians still argue whether Catherine fully comprehended the permanence of this turning point, or if hope lingered, however faintly, in her mind. The guards guide her through halls that now feel like labyrinthine corridors of judgment. You almost feel the eyes of every courtier upon her, weighing, whispering, and recording impressions. Mainstream accounts note that such an arrest was designed not only to secure the queen physically, but to erode her social power, turning even allies into cautious observers. Quirkily, some letters indicate that Catherine remained conscious of small details. How the floor felt beneath her feet, the glint of metal in the guard's armor, even the faint scent of wax and perfume in her chambers. Moments of sensory awareness that grounded her amidst the storm. You follow the shift in atmosphere as Catherine is moved from her private quarters to more controlled environments. The sense of isolation is immediate and total. The usual comfort of Whitehall, the music, the companions, the perfumed air, vanishes, replaced by quiet observation, restrained movement, and the realization that her every action is now a matter of record. Historians still argue whether this immediate removal from familiar surroundings was intended as psychological pressure, practical containment, or both. Mainstream history emphasizes that Tudor courts used such methods to control perception and assert authority, with even a queen subjected to the same rigor as lesser nobility in cases of scandal. You can almost sense Catherine recalibrating, attempting to maintain dignity, even as panic whispers in her mind. Every gesture becomes meaningful, every response potentially recorded for posterity or for Henry's judgment. Quirkily, some anecdotal letters suggest that she retained a certain poise, smoothing her skirts and adjusting her posture. Tiny acts of defiance or self-preservation that signal an enduring awareness of performance, even in crisis. By the time she is secured and the doors close behind her, you feel the full weight of the arrest. Whitehall's corridors, once lively with chatter and intrigue, now carry a subdued, almost reverent hush. Catherine, removed from the sphere of her previous influence, begins to understand the magnitude of what has happened. Favor has evaporated. Whispers have solidified into accusation, and the path before her narrows to one fraught with danger and uncertainty. Mainstream history marks this arrest as the first step in a rapid decline that will culminate in trial and execution. Historians still argue whether the pace of events that followed was inevitable given her circumstances or accelerated by enemies exploiting Henry's anger. You sense the transformation not only in Catherine, but in the atmosphere of Whitehall itself. The palace feels heavier, more cautious, filled with tension and unspoken judgment. Every corridor, every glance, every whispered comment reflects the consequences of proximity to power and the fragility of favor. Catherine's arrest is more than a physical removal. It is the opening chapter of a story where survival, reputation, and history converge in a tense, unfolding drama. Quirkily, some chroniclers note that servants and minor courtiers would later recount the episode with a mix of awe and disbelief, remembering small, human moments amidst the grandeur and fear, giving the story an unexpected texture beyond the official narrative. You can almost feel the chill of the Tower of London wrap around Catherine as she is escorted through its imposing gates, the stone walls cold and unyielding, echoing with centuries of whispered secrets and long-forgotten cries. The transition from Whitehall's gilded corridors to the tower's gray, damp chambers is jarring. The lively energy of courtly intrigue, replaced by the oppressive weight of confinement. Mainstream history reminds us that the tower was both a fortress and a prison, designed to contain those whom the king wished removed from sight, whether for protection, punishment, or political maneuvering. Quirkily, some contemporaries noted that certain birds in the tower would sometimes mimic the cries of imprisoned nobles, creating an eerie soundtrack that seemed almost intentional, as if the walls themselves wished to remind inhabitants of their peril. Historians still argue whether the psychological terror of the tower was intended primarily to punish or to coerce confessions and loyalty. You follow Catherine as she enters her cell, a modest space with narrow windows and the faint, damp scent of stone and metal. It's not overtly cruel, but the isolation and sudden severing from courtly life create a pressure that presses upon the mind and body alike. She notices the difference immediately. Servants are fewer, her attendants more subdued, and the sounds of the city feel distant, filtered through thick walls and heavy gates. Mainstream accounts emphasize that imprisonment in the tower was designed to limit freedom and communication, though prisoners of status often received some comforts and company under strict supervision. Quirkily, letters from later inmates mention attempts to amuse themselves with small routines, counting floor stones, tracing cracks in the walls, or exchanging subtle gestures with passing guards as a means to retain some sense of control over their confinement. Catherine's thoughts turn inward, You can almost feel her recollecting every step that brought her here. Flirtations, letters, careless smiles, the subtle currents of court life that suddenly seemed to have been misjudged. The excitement and charm of Whitehall now appeared distant, almost dreamlike. Historians still argue whether her earlier behavior constituted true malfeasance in the eyes of her contemporaries, or if it was amplified by the court's relentless scrutiny and Henry's volatile temperament. Mainstream history records that her confinement was the beginning of a process in which her past would be investigated, testimony gathered, and her fate increasingly dependent on both fact and perception. You notice the subtle shifts in her daily life. Meals arrive on trays, spoken conversation is limited, and the small rituals that once structured her day are replaced by the monotony of guarded hours. Catherine's presence is constantly monitored, even in moments of solitude, creating a psychological weight that is almost tangible. Quirkily, some letters describe prisoners attempting coded communication through tapping walls or subtle gestures, an echo of courtly intrigue adapted to the confines of the tower. Such ingenuity underscores the persistence of social intelligence even in the most restrictive environments. The court, outside, continues its relentless observation. You can almost feel the tension radiating through the capital. Courtiers speculate on the Queen's state, scribes record accounts, and the king awaits news filtered through trusted advisors. Mainstream accounts note that imprisonment in the tower was as much a spectacle as a containment strategy, signaling both authority and moral censure. Historians still argue whether the visibility of Catherine's confinement was intended to warn other court figures or primarily to isolate her until her trial. Inside her cell, Catherine begins to grapple with her isolation. You sense her trying to maintain composure, smoothing her hair, adjusting her skirts, and observing the subtle behaviors of her attendants, aware that any display of panic or defiance could be reported. Quirkily, some contemporaneous accounts suggest she kept small items from court, a ribbon, a trinket, or a note tucked discreetly, finding comfort in tangible reminders of a world that now feels almost unreal. These objects, while minor, provide psychological anchors amid a life suddenly stripped of freedom and social influence. You feel the slow, creeping tension of uncertainty that defines her confinement. Days stretch into weeks, each moment measured by observation, correspondence, and the occasional visitor sent to interrogate or gather testimony. Mainstream history notes that her time in the tower involved careful questioning, surveillance, and the collection of evidence regarding her previous liaisons, procedures that would culminate in a formal investigation. Historians still argue whether these interrogations were fair assessments of behavior or strategically structured to ensure a predetermined outcome. Catherine also senses the social isolation more acutely. Friends and allies are few and cautious. Courtiers hesitate to show visible support, and the flow of information is tightly controlled. You can almost feel the loneliness pressing against her, mingling with the creeping anxiety about what will come next. Quirkily, some letters hint that she sought solace in song or whispered prayers, small acts of ritual that provided fleeting comfort amid a landscape of control and confinement. By the end of this initial period in the Tower, you feel Catherine's transformation from a vivacious, charming queen to a young woman acutely aware of vulnerability, scrutiny, and the consequences of past actions. The walls of her cell are more than stone. They are witnesses to her fears, her reflections, and the growing awareness that her fate is now inextricably tied to the relentless machinery of justice, perception, and royal authority. Mainstream history portrays this stage as the crucial first phase of her downfall, while historians still argue about the degree to which she could have influenced outcomes once confined. The Tower is no longer just a building. It is a stage upon which the drama of her life will unfold to its tragic conclusion. You can almost feel the quiet pressure in Catherine's cell as interrogations begin, a series of carefully orchestrated questions designed to uncover truth, rumor, and anything in between. The atmosphere is heavy with expectation. The guards, attendants, and emissaries who bring inquiries are both polite and unrelenting, their presence a constant reminder that her words carry consequences far beyond the immediate room. Mainstream history records that Catherine faced multiple interrogations regarding her alleged past affairs, particularly with Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham, and her responses were scrutinized for both content and demeanor. Quirkily, some contemporary notes mention that interrogators sometimes brought props, letters, gloves, or small gifts to elicit recognition or confession, a subtle form of psychological prompting that must have felt almost theatrical to the Queen. Historians still argue whether Catherine's varying admissions were calculated, naive, or the result of sheer pressure under intense confinement. You follow Catherine as she carefully crafts her answers, aware that every word could be used against her. You can almost feel the tension radiate from her, the mental balancing act between honesty, self-preservation, and the hope, however slim, that a controlled confession might temper Henry's wrath. Mainstream accounts emphasize that Tudor interrogation often combined careful questioning with social and psychological pressure. Witnesses and prisoners were expected to navigate these moments with both caution and diplomacy. Quirkily, some letters suggest Catherine occasionally used pauses, gestures, and small flourishes of politeness to influence the tone of proceedings, a subtle performance that drew on the social skills honed during her time at court. The process of confession and denial is labyrinthine. You sense Catherine's inner conflict as she recalls events from her teenage years, flirtations that now seem weighty and fraught, interactions once private, now presented as evidence of moral failure. Every recollection is measured, sifted, and sometimes reframed to protect herself while satisfying the interrogators. Historians still argue whether her denials were fully believed by the court, or whether they merely delayed the inevitable judgment. Mainstream history notes that her careful navigation of the questioning reflected both a desire to maintain dignity and the limited options available to her within the Tudor legal system. You can almost hear the whisper of her thoughts as she weighs how much to reveal, how much to deny, and which admissions might mitigate severity. The questions are relentless, probing not just acts, but intentions, associations, and interpretations. You feel the pressure mounting as the interrogators pivot between gentle inquiry and pointed accusation, their manner calculated to uncover inconsistencies. Quirkily, some observers noted that Catherine occasionally used humor or self-deprecation to deflect tension, tiny shields in a psychological battle where every slip could be fatal. Her interactions reveal the interplay between memory, perception, and political necessity. You sense the friction between her desire for honesty and the practical need to protect herself. Every statement scrutinized, not just for content, but for its effect on reputation and royal favor. Mainstream accounts emphasize that even carefully framed denials could be twisted or interpreted unfavorably, a perilous dynamic in the world of Tudor justice. Historians still argue whether Catherine's strategy of partial admissions and selective denials was an effective approach or a symptom of her inexperience under extreme pressure. You can almost feel the courtroom of the mind she constructs as she prepares for each session, anticipating questions, recalling events, and imagining the likely interpretations of each phrase. The line between truth and performance blurs as she navigates the delicate demands of self-preservation. Quirkily, some chroniclers mention that she occasionally recited past events in the form of short narratives or playful anecdotes, a method that may have provided clarity to herself while attempting to control how information was received. The emotional weight is palpable. You sense the tension of recalling flirtations and past intimacy while under observation. The sense that private history has become public judgment. Mainstream history highlights the psychological strain of such interrogations, noting that Catherine's youth and limited experience with legal or political scrutiny left her vulnerable to both manipulation and misinterpretation. Historians still argue whether her demeanor, calm, composed, yet occasionally nervous, was strategic or simply a natural reaction to fear and shock. You follow the subtle dynamics of power in these exchanges. Interrogators, aware of her vulnerability, exert influence with carefully placed questions, suggestive comments, and calculated silences. Catherine, in turn, must use wit, poise, and intelligence to maintain some measure of control over the narrative, aware that a single misstep could seal her fate. Quirkily, some reports suggest she sometimes rehearsed answers quietly before sessions, a private performance aimed at bolstering confidence and clarity under pressure. By the end of these sessions, you feel the cumulative weight of confession and denial pressing on Catherine. Every admission, every carefully phrased denial, every calculated gesture contributes to a delicate balance between survival and inevitability. Mainstream history records that while some of her responses were accepted as mitigating factors, the overall trajectory toward judgment was already set. Historians still argue whether different choices during these interrogations could have materially altered her fate, or if the machinery of court and kingly authority made her downfall unavoidable. You sense that Catherine's time in the Tower has evolved from physical containment to a far more insidious trial of mind, character, and reputation. A crucible where every word carries consequences that extend beyond the moment. You can almost feel the chill of anticipation hanging over Whitehall as Catherine's trial begins to take shape. A formal process that transforms whispers, letters, and private knowledge into public spectacle. The air is thick with tension, every chamber and corridor humming with curiosity and judgment. Mainstream history records that the trial against Catherine Howard involved formal examinations of her alleged affairs, testimonies from attendants and former acquaintances, and the presentation of letters as evidence of impropriety. Quirkily, some contemporaries noted that trial preparations included dramatic gestures by clerks and officials, almost as if the act of arranging documents and witnesses was part of a theater designed to impress or intimidate. Historians still argue whether the trial was a genuine search for truth or largely a political performance, orchestrated to satisfy the king and his court. You follow Catherine as the first testimonies are presented. You can almost feel the subtle weight of each word, each accusation, each corroboration of rumor pressing upon her. Former companions recount flirtations, past interactions, and observed behaviors, each framed to emphasize impropriety. Mainstream accounts note that the witnesses' statements varied in reliability, influenced by personal rivalries, loyalty to the crown, and fear of reprisal, which complicates the historical record. Quirkily, some letters hint that witnesses occasionally exaggerated minor incidents. A hand touched too long, a smile held too knowingly, to dramatize the Queen's alleged transgressions, a reflection of courtly exaggeration, magnified by political necessity. The trial is both public and psychological, a high-stakes display in which perception is as crucial as fact. You feel Catherine's pulse quicken with every account, each testimony a reminder of her vulnerability. Each letter introduced a tangible representation of private moments made public. Historians still argue whether the presentation of evidence, particularly the letters between her and Culpeper, was conducted with full integrity or manipulated to ensure a predetermined verdict. Mainstream accounts emphasize that Tudor trials for queens were as much about maintaining royal authority and moral example as about uncovering factual guilt. You can sense the court buzzing with intrigue. The noble audience leans in to catch every word. Court officials scribble notes, and the king himself, though absent from much of the procedural formalities, exercises his influence through advisors who guide testimony and focus attention. Quirkily, some chronicles describe the dramatic timing of witness arrivals, the careful display of letters, and the deliberate pacing of sessions, as if the trial were part moral adjudication, part theater. Catherine, aware of every nuance, adjusts her composure, balancing acknowledgement of testimony with the maintenance of dignity. As testimonies progress, you feel the slow, inexorable tightening of the legal noose. Witnesses recount observations of flirtations, late-night meetings, and exchanges that once seemed innocent but now read as scandalous. Mainstream history records that the testimony of her former music tutor, her ladies-in-waiting, and even distant acquaintances contributed to a mosaic of evidence that portrayed a queen who had allegedly betrayed both the king and her position. Historians still argue whether the testimony reflected accurate recollection, embellishment, or coerced narrative shaped by fear of royal displeasure. You almost hear Catherine's inner calculations. How to respond, how to maintain poise, how to navigate the complex web of social and legal expectation. Each response must be precise, measured, and deferential. A misstep potentially magnified to ruin. Quirkily, some letters suggest that Catherine occasionally smiled or nodded in ways that were interpreted differently by various court observers. Gestures that historians now debate as either composure under stress or naive misreading of courtly expectation. The weight of history presses on every exchange. You can feel the tension of a system in which private affection becomes legal jeopardy, where charm and youth are no protection against the machinery of law and reputation. Mainstream accounts highlight that trials of queens were exceptional in their visibility and impact, designed to reinforce the moral and political authority of the king. Historians still argue whether Catherine's brief queenship, combined with her alleged indiscretions, made her a unique target or simply a convenient scapegoat in a highly performative system. You notice the subtle dynamics among the witnesses. Some seem reluctant, their voices wavering. Others are eager, embellishing for perceived advantage or survival. Every glance, every hesitation, every carefully chosen word contributes to the pressure on Catherine. Quirkily, some contemporary accounts hint that witnesses sometimes sought subtle approval from officials before speaking, a way to navigate their own precarious positions in a court defined by hierarchy and fear. By the end of the early proceedings, you can almost feel Catherine's awareness of the precariousness of her situation. Each testimony, each documented letter, each corroborated rumor builds toward an inevitable conclusion. Mainstream history stresses that the trial, while legal in form, was as much about spectacle and demonstration of royal authority as about establishing factual guilt. Historians still argue whether the cumulative weight of evidence against Catherine reflected genuine moral transgression or the convergence of rumor, political expedience, and Henry's volatile judgment. The trial leaves a palpable imprint on the atmosphere of Whitehall. You feel the energy shift. Curiosity mingles with judgment, and the social balance of power begins to pivot as whispers of verdicts circulate. Catherine, once the vivacious young queen, now moves through the palace and the tower as a figure under scrutiny, not just for past actions, but for what her situation reveals about obedience, morality, and the consequences of personal choice in the unforgiving environment of Tudor rule. Quirkily, some contemporaneous letters suggest she retained moments of composure and even levity, small glimpses of her personality that historians now debate as either courageous dignity or tragic naivety in the face of insurmountable odds. You can almost feel the air thicken with the weight of interpretation as historians descend, centuries later, to puzzle over Catherine Howard's life and downfall. The story that unfolded in Whitehall and the Tower is no longer merely a sequence of events. It is a landscape of conjecture, bias, and competing narratives. You sense the layers, The documented facts of her arrest and execution, the fragmentary letters and testimonies, and the more sensational tales that circulated through Tudor England and beyond. Mainstream history acknowledges that Catherine's brief queenship, less than 2 years, provides a dense, complex case study of courtly life, royal authority, and personal agency. Quirkily, some historians entertain theories that Catherine's childhood and schooling included secret lessons in espionage or social manipulation, ideas born from imaginative interpretations of her charm and cunning. Historians still argue whether she was a naive adolescent swept into a perilous world, or a subtly strategic player who misjudged the risks. You feel the intricacy of scholarly debate unfold. Every act of Catherine, her flirtations, letters, and private meetings, becomes a point of contention. Mainstream accounts often portray her as reckless and inexperienced, yet alternative readings emphasize her youth, the intense pressures of Henry VIII's court, and the highly gendered expectations imposed on queens. You almost hear the echo of modern academics quibbling over motives, reliability of witnesses, and the cultural context of sexual morality. Quirkily, some scholars hypothesize that Catherine's vivacity and charm were deliberately exaggerated in posthumous accounts, feeding Tudor propaganda that painted her as a cautionary tale of female impropriety. Historians still argue whether these embellishments reflect historical reality or are artifacts of a court obsessed with spectacle, gossip, and moral instruction. You sense the tension between evidence and interpretation. Letters from the period, some authentic, some rumored, invite conflicting readings. Was she complicit, ignorant, or coerced? Mainstream history often highlights that certain letters and testimonies, particularly those involving Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham, form the backbone of the case against her. Yet gaps and ambiguities make definitive conclusions difficult. Quirkily, some researchers note that the precise wording in these letters, innocuous, in isolation, was weaponized in court, illustrating how language could shift from casual intimacy to evidence of treachery. Historians still argue whether the harsh judgment of Catherine reflects objective legal evaluation or a patriarchal court culture eager to enforce moral orthodoxy. You can almost feel the threads of speculation winding through every scholarly discussion. Catherine's upbringing, her placement at court, her family background, and her social interactions are dissected endlessly. Mainstream accounts emphasize the vulnerability of young women in Tudor society, especially those thrust into high courtly positions with limited agency. Quirkily, some fringe theories suggest that Catherine's grandmother or tutors may have coached her in flirtation as a survival skill, a controversial notion that blends social history with psychological conjecture. Historians still argue whether such influences would have provided meaningful protection or simply deepened her exposure to peril. The question of intent becomes central. You feel the pulse of debate. Did Catherine knowingly risk her position, or was she ensnared by circumstance and the unavoidable attention of a jealous and suspicious king? Mainstream history underscores that Henry VIII's expectations of his queens were exacting and frequently contradictory, demanding both subservience and vitality, obedience and charm. Quirkily, some scholars note that Catherine may have misread signals from her husband, interpreting fleeting attentions as leniency rather than warnings, a human error that resonates across time. Historians still argue whether her decisions were naive miscalculations or evidence of conscious navigation in an impossible social environment. You almost sense the debate extending beyond historical detail into moral judgment. The popular imagination has long oscillated between sympathy for Catherine and condemnation, a dynamic that complicates scholarly efforts to establish a balanced view. Mainstream accounts often caution against projecting modern standards onto Tudor contexts, yet public fascination with her story continues to color interpretation. Quirkily, some historians speculate about how Catherine herself might have viewed her own choices, imagining private reflections that are tantalizingly absent from the historical record. Historians still argue whether such conjecture can meaningfully inform understanding or simply risks romanticizing tragedy. The interplay of gender, power, and youth frames every puzzle. You feel the pressures that surrounded Catherine, not just Henry's wrath, but societal expectations, family influence, and courtly intrigue. Mainstream history emphasizes that her vulnerability was systemic, shaped by the gendered limitations and social structures of Tudor England. Quirkily, some academic analyses explore psychological profiling, imagining her responses under extreme stress, and how personality traits may have influenced both behavior and perception. Historians still argue whether her downfall is primarily a story of personal misjudgment, structural vulnerability, or a combination of both. You follow the lingering uncertainty across the centuries. Every interpretation, from contemporary chroniclers to modern scholars, introduces bias, context, and cultural lens. Mainstream accounts treat her as a cautionary figure, yet revisions continue to probe her humanity, innocence, and agency. Quirkily, some experimental historians attempt to reconstruct her life through reenactments, analysis of social networks, and even psychological models, highlighting the fascination her story continues to inspire. Historians still argue whether definitive answers about her intent, knowledge, or culpability are ever attainable. By the end of this exploration, you feel Catherine's story not as a static historical episode, but as a living puzzle, one that engages imagination, moral reflection, and critical analysis. Mainstream history frames her as a young queen caught in the ruthless machinery of Tudor power, while historians still argue over the balance of personal choice, coercion, and circumstance. You sense the paradox. Catherine's life, brief yet vivid, leaves more questions than answers, a tale that continues to haunt, provoke, and inspire inquiry. Quirkily, some conclude that the very mystery surrounding her character, her intentions, decisions, and inner life, is part of what ensures that she remains one of the most fascinating figures of Henry VIII's court. You can almost feel the somber weight descend over Whitehall as Catherine Howard's sentencing begins to crystallize into reality. The court, still buzzing with speculation, now focuses not on rumors or testimonies, but on the explicit decree that will seal her fate. Mainstream history records that after thorough examination of evidence and interrogation, the formal verdict of guilty was pronounced, condemning Catherine to death for adultery, a charge that in Tudor England carried inevitable consequences. Quirkily, some contemporary observers commented on the ceremonial precision of such announcements. Robes adjusted, guards aligned, officials reading proclamations with exaggerated solemnity, as if the gravity of the moment required theatrical reinforcement. Historians still argue whether the speed and decisiveness of the sentencing reflected the clarity of evidence or the king's impatience for a public demonstration of authority. You feel the tension ripple through Catherine as the verdict is delivered. Her youth, vivacity, and past charm now collide with the weight of irreversible judgment. Every witness, every letter, every prior action seems to crystallize into a single, unavoidable trajectory. Mainstream accounts emphasize that sentencing in Tudor England was both a legal and moral spectacle, designed to affirm royal power and enforce societal norms. Quirkily, some letters hint that Catherine retained small gestures of dignity, adjusting a sleeve, straightening a ribbon, or pausing gracefully, which contemporaries noted as almost incongruous with the severity of the sentence. The court's atmosphere is heavy with expectation and subdued dread. You almost hear the whisper of courtiers, the subtle movements of officials, and the faint echo of ceremonial footsteps marking the occasion. Mainstream history notes that public and private observation of sentencing served to reinforce both the king's authority and the cautionary example for others, especially women of the court. Historians still argue whether Catherine's demeanor, often described as composed and serene, was a product of acceptance, shock, or carefully measured performance, designed to preserve some control over her dignity. You can feel the subtle interplay of power and ritual. Guards stand silently. Officials maintain precise posture, and the proclamation of sentence carries both weight and rhythm, a mixture of law, ceremony, and intimidation. Quirkily, some observers of the period remarked that Catherine's brief gestures of acknowledgement, slight inclinations of the head, minimal eye contact, were interpreted variously as humility, courage, or even resignation, illustrating how every small motion could be loaded with meaning. The sentencing extends beyond the mere reading of words. You almost sense the cumulative force of courtly politics, Henry's personality, and societal expectation converging to dictate her fate. Mainstream accounts stress that Tudor legal proceedings, especially those involving royalty, were entwined with symbolism and performative power as much as procedural justice. Historians still argue whether the timing, wording, and manner of the announcement were dictated by procedural necessity or calculated to make an example of the young queen. You feel Catherine's awareness sharpen. Every gesture, every intake of breath, every fleeting expression observed by those present. The weight of inevitability presses against her, yet you sense traces of resilience in the way she carries herself. Quirkily, some letters suggest she made subtle attempts to preserve her image, adjusting her posture or attire, not for defiance, but to assert a lingering sense of personal agency in a moment otherwise stripped of control. The sentence, once delivered, resonates beyond the immediate chamber. You almost feel it echo through the corridors of Whitehall, through the whispers of courtiers, through the delicate tapestries and polished floors that have witnessed intrigue, scandal, and performance. Mainstream history records that the announcement served multiple purposes. It informed the court, reinforced the king's moral authority, and communicated the consequences of disloyalty or moral deviation to the wider nobility. Historians still argue whether the theatricality surrounding sentencing was designed primarily to instruct, intimidate, or satisfy the king's desire for spectacle. Catherine now becomes the embodiment of both caution and tragedy. You sense the way her presence, once lively, admired, and influential, is now transformed into a symbol of royal judgment and social warning. Quirkily, some chroniclers noted that even minor details, like the slight tilt of her head or the fold of her hands, were recorded as evidence of composure, with later historians debating whether these gestures were conscious or instinctual. You can almost feel the court exhale collectively, a mixture of tension, curiosity, and resignation settling over Whitehall. The sentencing is more than an official declaration. It is the crystallization of a narrative that had been building through rumor, observation, and royal scrutiny. Mainstream accounts stress that the formality of the sentence solidified the legal and social consequences, ensuring that Catherine's fall was public, memorable, and complete. Historians still argue whether any procedural nuance could have altered her path once the king's decision coalesced. By the end of the sentencing, you sense the full scope of Catherine's predicament. Her charm, youth, and vivacity cannot counter the combined weight of law, custom, and Henry's wrath. She is poised on the threshold of history, a figure whose story will ripple through time as both cautionary tale and subject of enduring fascination. Quirkily, some letters hint that Catherine retained brief, fleeting moments of reflection, small mental rehearsals of dignity and grace, as if attempting to exert control over the narrative of her life, even in its final chapters. You can almost feel the oppressive quiet of the tower as Catherine Howard enters her final days, a period suffused with reflection, fear, and an uncanny clarity that comes when the inevitable looms. The walls, cold and gray, seem to close in, carrying the faint echo of previous prisoners' whispered fears and forgotten lamentations. Mainstream history records that Catherine spent several weeks confined to her chambers after sentencing, visited only by guards, spiritual advisors, and the occasional court official, the monotony broken only by the careful recording of her condition and statements. Quirkily, some letters suggest that she took comfort in small routines, rearranging objects, inspecting her reflection in polished surfaces, and rehearsing prayers aloud as a subtle way to reclaim agency within her narrow world. Historians still argue whether these routines were practical coping mechanisms or symbolic gestures of dignity intended to influence perception. You feel the mixture of panic and composure coursing through her. Every knock at the door, every shadow crossing the corridor, is a reminder of her precarious position. Mainstream accounts note that the Queen's health and demeanor were closely monitored, partly to ensure that the execution proceeded without complications, and partly to provide the king and court with a sense of ceremonial order. Quirkily, some anecdotal sources suggest that Catherine occasionally sang softly to herself, perhaps to soothe nerves, perhaps to assert a lingering sense of identity amid complete confinement. You can almost sense her mind racing, recalling moments of laughter and courtly intrigue that now feel distant, almost unreal. Former letters, flirtations, and idle smiles are reframed under the harsh light of impending consequence. Historians still argue whether her reflections were purely personal or influenced by advisors encouraging repentance and contrition in preparation for death. Mainstream history emphasizes that Tudor prisoners of high status were often guided by spiritual counsel during final days, a mix of psychological support and moral instruction intended to shape both behavior and public perception. You feel the subtle interplay of time and routine in her last days. Meals arrive with careful regularity, attendants move silently, and Catherine adjusts to a rhythm dictated entirely by her confinement. Quirkily, some sources hint that she requested small comforts, a particular book, a ribbon, or a favored trinket, suggesting a human need to maintain connection to her previous life, even as it slipped away. Mainstream accounts confirm that such requests were often granted selectively, both as a courtesy and as a means to ensure calm during a period of high scrutiny. The emotional weight is almost tangible. You sense Catherine's oscillation between resignation and brief flashes of hope, moments when she might imagine clemency, reconciliation, or simply the illusion of time reclaimed. Historians still argue whether her composure in this period reflected acceptance, strategic performance, or the numbing effect of prolonged stress and confinement. Mainstream history notes that her spiritual advisors likely encouraged penitent reflection, guiding her toward confession and moral alignment with the expectations of the king and God. You can almost hear the whisper of her thoughts as she navigates correspondence, prayers, and internal reflection. Every letter to the king or confidant, every statement to a chaplain, carries layered meaning. Personal repentance, a request for mercy, or subtle assertion of selfhood. Quirkily, some accounts suggest that she occasionally used humor or anecdotal recollection, even in letters or spiritual conversations. Tiny flickers of personality amid an otherwise grim tableau. The days are measured not only by routine, but by psychological intensity. You feel the pressure of anticipation mounting with each passing hour. The awareness that the trajectory set by royal authority and legal process is immutable. Mainstream history emphasizes that prisoners of her rank often experience this period acutely, with mental strain amplified by isolation, awareness of public scrutiny, and the social weight of dishonor. Historians still argue whether Catherine's apparent calm was genuine stoicism or a careful performance designed to control narrative, even in extremis. You sense the subtle, almost theatrical elements of the final period. Visitors, guards, and spiritual advisors all contribute to a performance of dignity and moral rectitude, both for the observer and the observed. Quirkily, some reports note that Catherine occasionally adjusted her posture, clothing, or accessories with meticulous care, a small assertion of agency and grace that resonates with modern readers as a human response to imminent mortality. As the days progress, the reality of execution becomes increasingly present. You can almost feel the compression of time, hours stretched by anxiety, punctuated by ritual, and shortened by the inevitability of the end. Mainstream history records that she met with spiritual counsel frequently, prepared for confession, and attempted to reconcile with both her fate and the king's judgment. Historians still argue whether such preparation reflects genuine piety, social expectation, or strategic positioning to preserve a measure of dignity in history's eyes. By the end of these final days, you sense a profound transformation. Catherine is no longer merely the vivacious young queen whose charm enchanted Henry VIII. She's a figure of tragic inevitability, caught between personal agency and overwhelming circumstance. Quirkily, some letters note that she maintained brief, fleeting gestures of reflection, arranging objects or rehearsing phrases, small acts of control that underline the human need to assert identity, even in the face of death. Mainstream accounts underscore that her final days were marked by reflection, ritual, and an acute awareness of how her story would echo through time. While historians still argue how much of her comportment was conscious strategy versus natural human coping, you can almost feel the tension of that early morning as Catherine Howard is led from her cell, the tower corridors echoing with quiet footsteps, whispered prayers, and the weight of centuries of precedent. The air is cold, damp, and thick with anticipation, almost as if the walls themselves are mourning. Mainstream history records that Catherine was executed on February 13, 1542, at the Tower of London. Her youth and beauty contrasted starkly with the severity of her fate. Quirkily, some letters from the period describe her last moments in surprisingly mundane detail, adjusting her hair, smoothing her sleeves, or pausing to observe a bird outside a window, as though small rituals of normalcy helped maintain composure. Historians still argue whether these gestures were deliberate acts of courage or simple, unconscious attempts to reclaim dignity. You follow her as she steps into the open air, a brief chill biting at her skin, the sunlight muted by the gray winter sky. Guards flank her, their expressions neutral but firm, a living reminder of authority and inevitability. Mainstream accounts emphasize that executions of high-status prisoners were carefully managed to convey order, justice, and the moral expectations of the king. Quirkily, some chroniclers note that Catherine's attendants reportedly whispered encouragements or recited prayers, small acts of comfort that reflect both devotion and the human desire to provide reassurance even in dire circumstances. You feel the quiet tension of the crowd gathering, though modest, with courtiers and officials present to witness the event. Every movement is observed, every word, every glance, adding layers of meaning to the ceremony. Historians still argue whether the presence of these spectators was primarily for the king's demonstration of control, for a moral instruction, or simply a byproduct of courtly procedure. Mainstream history highlights that public and semi-public executions served as both punishment and spectacle, reinforcing societal and royal authority. Catherine's final moments are marked by a mixture of composure and introspection. You can almost sense her internal dialogue, memories of Whitehall, fleeting flirtations, moments of laughter and fear, compressing into a single awareness of consequence. Quirkily, some letters suggest that she recited short prayers or phrases aloud, not just for spiritual solace, but as a way of asserting identity and consciousness amid the ritualized march toward death. The executioner moves with solemn precision, a figure both feared and necessary, embodying the authority of the crown. You feel the ritualized cadence of the event, footsteps on cold stone, whispers of prayer, the subtle sound of fabric brushing against floor, the ceremonial adjustments of guards and attendants. Mainstream accounts record that Catherine maintained poise and dignity, even requesting brief allowances to settle her attire, demonstrating awareness of the lasting impression her conduct would leave. Historians still argue whether this composure reflected courage, resignation, or an instinctive performance cultivated from her courtly experience. You almost hear the faint, controlled breathing, the subtle rhythm of final preparations, and the distant murmur of observers adjusting to the inevitability of the moment. Quirkily, some sources mention that Catherine momentarily paused to glance at the tower itself, perhaps in silent reflection or acknowledgement of the storied walls that had contained her final days. Mainstream history emphasizes that executions were as much symbolic as punitive, the last act of visible affirmation of the king's authority and the moral expectations imposed upon queens. As the sentence is carried out, you feel the stark juxtaposition of her youth and the finality of the moment, the quiet discipline of the attendants, the precision of the ritual, and the measured gravity of the proceedings underscore the gravity of Tudor justice. Quirkily, some chroniclers note that small details, like the angle of her head or the folding of her hands, were meticulously recorded, reflecting the fascination with composure, dignity, and the moral resonance of behavior at death. Historians still argue whether these observations were meaningful reflections of character or simply anecdotal embellishments amplified over time. The aftermath reverberates through court and country. You sense the ripple of consequence. Courtiers whisper, the king asserts authority, and the story of Catherine's life, charm, and downfall becomes a cautionary tale etched into the collective memory of the court. Mainstream accounts stress that her death served as both punishment and deterrent, demonstrating the consequences of disloyalty, moral failure, or misjudged ambition. Quirkily, some letters describe the court's fascination with small relics from her chambers or her personal effects, tangible reminders that humanize her beyond the legal and ceremonial narrative. You almost feel the lingering tension in Whitehall. Courtiers navigating perception, servants adjusting to the absence of their queen, and advisors interpreting the political and moral message conveyed by the execution. Historians still argue whether Henry's personal feelings, rage, betrayal, or political calculation dominated the orchestration of her death, or whether procedure and precedent played a stronger role. Mainstream history notes that Catherine's execution exemplifies the intersection of personal misconduct, royal authority, and societal norms in Tudor England. By the end of this grim chapter, you sense that Catherine Howard, youthful, vivacious, and tragically flawed, has become more than a historical figure. She's a symbol of courtly vulnerability, the consequences of misjudged choices, and the enduring fascination with the intersection of charm, power, and peril. Quirkily, even centuries later, small details of her life, gestures, letters, and anecdotes continue to spark debate, reflection, and empathy, keeping her story alive in ways that outlast the tower walls themselves. You can almost feel the echo of Catherine Howard's brief life reverberating through time, a whisper in the corridors of history that grows louder with each retelling. Her story is stitched into the tapestry of Tudor England. Youthful exuberance, courtly charm, scandal, and a tragic, inevitable fall. Mainstream history emphasizes that Catherine's legacy is inseparable from Henry VIII's reign, reflecting both the perils faced by young queens and the intense scrutiny of royal morality. Quirkily, some historians speculate that Catherine's enduring fascination owes as much to her personal charm and beauty as to the dramatic circumstances of her downfall, with her story inspiring literature, plays, and modern media centuries later. Historians still argue whether she should be remembered primarily as a cautionary figure, a victim of circumstance, or a complex personality navigating impossible pressures. You can almost feel the cultural reverberations of her story. Tales of Catherine's life circulated in pamphlets, letters, and chronicles soon after her death, often exaggerated or moralized for maximum effect. Mainstream accounts note that her youthful indiscretions and tragic end became a potent symbol in the Tudor imagination, a moral lesson for courtiers and commoners alike. Quirkily, some writers suggest that even her fashion choices and personal adornments were catalogued and commented on, small but vivid details feeding the intrigue of posterity. Historians still argue how much these accounts reflected reality versus the embellishment of gossip and political messaging. You follow the subtle shifts in memory over the centuries. Catherine's name evokes both sympathy and scandal, innocence and misjudgment. Mainstream history frames her as a young queen whose vulnerabilities collided with a ruthless court and a king who demanded absolute authority, showing how personal behavior could have public consequences beyond comprehension. Quirkily, modern writers sometimes speculate on the psychological pressures she faced, imagining the inner dialogues of a young woman caught between desire, expectation, and survival, a humanizing lens often absent in contemporary sources. Historians still argue whether modern reinterpretations risk romanticizing her story or offer deeper insight into Tudor gender and power dynamics. You can almost feel the way her story shaped perceptions of female agency at court. Catherine's life and death became part of a broader cultural conversation about obedience, virtue, and the precarious position of women in hierarchical societies. Mainstream accounts stress that her downfall reinforced the king's authority and the moral order he demanded, sending a clear message to future queens and courtiers. Quirkily, some scholars note that her tale influenced artistic and literary representations of doomed or tragic young women, creating a subtle ripple through culture that extended far beyond Tudor England. Historians still argue whether her narrative was primarily instructive, sensationalized, or emblematic of gendered injustice. You sense the enduring fascination that Catherine inspires. Museum exhibits, historical novels, and television adaptations continue to explore her life, choices, and context, blending fact, interpretation, and imagination. Mainstream history acknowledges that she remains a compelling figure precisely because her story combines human vulnerability, courtly intrigue, and dramatic consequence. Quirkily, some analyses even compare her narrative to contemporary celebrity scandals, noting the timeless appeal of charisma intertwined with misfortune. Historians still argue how much her legend overshadows historical fact, and whether fascination with her beauty and youth skews interpretation. You can almost feel the echo of her decisions resonating in discussions of Tudor court dynamics, gendered expectations, and the consequences of transgression. Mainstream accounts note that Catherine's brief queenship continues to be studied as an example of the intersection between personal agency and structural constraint, where charm and social skill could not entirely protect against systemic vulnerability. Quirkily, some modern historians have playfully speculated on how Catherine might have navigated social media if she were alive today, highlighting the enduring human interest in public perception and reputation. Historians still argue whether such speculation illuminates her story or trivializes the historical context. You follow the delicate weaving of memory and myth. Catherine Howard exists simultaneously as a historical person, a cultural symbol, and a moral lesson, each lens emphasizing different facets of her life. Mainstream history stresses the importance of distinguishing between documented events and narrative embellishments. Yet the latter often shapes public perception more strongly than the former. Quirkily, some biographers delight in tracing tiny, overlooked details, letters, trinkets, and courtly anecdotes as windows into her personality, adding depth to a story often reduced to scandal. Historians still argue whether these small glimpses reveal meaningful truths or are interpreted through a modern fascination with narrative drama. You can almost feel the way her story invites empathy, curiosity, and reflection. Her youth, missteps, and ultimate fate challenge readers to consider the pressures of court life, the limitations imposed on women, and the consequences of actions magnified by power. Mainstream accounts view her life as a case study in historical vulnerability and societal expectation, while her story remains compelling precisely because of its human, emotional resonance. Quirkily, some contemporary writers draw parallels between Catherine's story and modern tales of ambition, reputation, and the fragility of public favor. Historians still argue how much contemporary resonance alters our interpretation of the past, versus revealing enduring truths about human behavior. By the end, you sense that Catherine Howard's life, though tragically brief, leaves a long shadow. Her charm misjudgments, and fate continue to capture imagination, provoke scholarly debate, and illuminate the perilous intersection of youth, beauty, and power in Tudor England. Mainstream history cements her as a symbol of caution and consequence, while historians still argue over the balance between victimhood, agency, and social expectation. Quirkily, the persistence of her story, through books, dramatizations, and museum exhibits, reminds you that history is never just about facts. It is about the people, choices, and echoes that live long after the final day. You can almost feel the gentle descent of the story now, a soft exhale after the intensity of court, scandal, and the harsh finality of Tudor justice. Imagine sitting back, the echoes of footsteps, whispered letters, and ceremonial pronouncements fading into the background, leaving only the quiet hum of history itself. Catherine Howard's life, though brief and tragic, offers more than scandal. It is a lens into the complexities of human behavior, societal expectation, and the delicate dance of power, youth, and choice. You might reflect on her vivacity in Whitehall, her whispered flirtations, and the careful steps she took to navigate a treacherous world, all of which became magnified under the unforgiving gaze of history. Think of the Tower, cold and echoing, where the weight of isolation pressed against her as she rehearsed words, prayers, and gestures that might preserve dignity. You almost feel the tension of those final days, the monotony, the fleeting comforts, and the quiet acts of defiance or grace that lingered in small gestures, letters, or mental rehearsals. Even in execution, in the stark choreography of power and consequence, Catherine's humanity shines through, a young woman confronting the intersection of personal choices and forces beyond her control. Quirkily, you might imagine her brief moments of levity, small acts of composure, or silent reflection, gestures that historians still debate, but that make her story endlessly human and relatable. And now, as you settle deeper, let the echoes of the past mingle with your thoughts. Consider how her story informs our understanding of courage, naivety, societal pressures, and the ways in which history is remembered, retold, and reshaped across centuries. In Catherine Howard, we find a cautionary tale, a tragic figure, and a mirror of human curiosity and fallibility, reminding you that every choice, every gesture, every fleeting moment can echo far beyond the immediacy of life. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let the story of Catherine Howard rest with you, a whisper of history settling into your mind as you drift toward dreams. Sweet dreams.